what we've seen throughout this crisis is that far, far more people are essential or critical workers than is generally imagined by ministers and officials when they set out to intervene in the economy and in society like this. So I think it's likely to be a very long list.
And, many people will say all workers are critical at the moment, to be quite frank, because we know how much damage has been done by the economy. I mean, we could, end up with huge proportions of the sort of the working population being actually exempt because so many people are actually critical to getting the country moving. Isn't it just sort of time to say, look, this system doesn't make sense. Let's just stop asking people to self-isolate and get the economy back up and running?
Yes, what I think we see now is that this is now the litmus test of whether we've learned to live with COVID like we live with flu so that we can get on with our lives. We know that the vaccines are working and we can trust them. We can count on the vaccines to keep people safe. But what I think ministers are now trying to do is to manage the extent of the cases in order to make sure that our progress to having an endemic disease isn't interrupted. They are telling us that privately. And that's what they're worried about, cases just getting out of control. So, I do think it's completely reasonable at this stage in the pandemic that people who have tested positive with a PCR test should be required to self-isolate. But I think what we're seeing is there's going to be enormous pressure on ministers to move as quickly as possible to ending the self-isolation of people who have just been pinged or had a contact and so on. As a matter of law, it isn't mandatory to self-isolate if it's just the app that contacts you. But of course, it is mandatory in other circumstances. So there's a potential for a degree of confusion there. But what I think ministers would want people to do is just isolate if the app or NHS Test and Trace tells them to. But as you say, what we'll see is enormous disruption across great swathes of our society until we end this problem of the pingdemic.
And do you have a view on those many, many firms, people in haulage, for example, people in supermarkets, who've started advising their employees to take a PCR test or lateral flow tests if they're pinged by the app instead of self-isolating, taking that into their own hands and sort of doing this idea that we all know that people will be doing from the 16th of August, according to government plans, taking that into their own hands because, as you say, it's not actually legally mandated that they isolate if they're pinged?
Yeah, so just to be clear, it's in relation to the app that it is not legally mandated to isolate. But what I would say is that we've all got to obey the law. So the government should be making sure they're really clear what is law and what is guidance. That's something I've said throughout this crisis. And they should also make sure that firms are clear about what their health and safety obligations are. But I can, of course, see why a firm would say it was only the app, take a PCR test and treat it as advisory. But ministers should be really clear about that, because we were in the absurd position this week that a minister of the Crown set out, as I have just done, what the law is, which is that the app is only advisory. And he was slapped down by Number 10. Well, that's because what the government overall is trying to do is just get people to isolate to try and reduce the number of cases. But you can see the consequences of that now for businesses across the country, businesses who are trying to recover. So my plea with ministers would be, we need crystal clear instructions. We need them to set out the difference between law and guidance, and that we need ministers to show businesses where they've got some discretion in order to keep their essential services going.
Is there an argument here, Steve Baker, that actually it's only a couple of weeks, only 3 or 4 weeks until the 16th of August when this guidance falls away for people who've had both their jabs anyway, and that potentially to keep the disease under control, people should bite their tongues, put up with this disruption, as disruptive as it is, just until we get to that 16th of August deadline?
Well, yes, and if ministers want to make that argument, they should make it very, very clearly. But I think what I'm seeing now is that people are really fed up with this. And as you set out, that people are looking for ways to get round the rules. And that isn't where we should be. We should have clarity about the dangers of the disease, what the risks actually are today now the vaccines are working. We should have clarity about businesses' responsibilities, clarity about where we do have personal responsibility for what we do. And the government should just make sure that people know where they stand. And if, as you say, the government just wants us to get through to mid-August, well, then they should be very clear with businesses exactly what they're being asked to do.
And can I just ask you on another rule that has been revealed over the last week or so, which is that the government plans to ask people who want to go to nightclubs and other large venues to prove they're double jabbed before they can enter those venues. I mean, what's your view on that? Because some people say that's incredibly authoritarian to sort of ban people from attending places just because they haven't had 2 doses of the vaccine. What's your view?
I've been very clear since the beginning that I'm absolutely against COVID status certification within the UK. I think for travel it's inevitable, but I'm absolutely flat out against this. To be coercing young people into having the vaccine in order to get on with enjoying themselves and living their lives, I think it is wrong, and I shall vote against it. And I'm confident a material number of Conservatives will do so, and it does look like Labour will vote with us. So I think if legislation is required, I think that government will struggle to get it through. I'd be confident, I think, at this point that that the government would be defeated if they tried. But the point really here is that we do need young people to be vaccinated in order for the population to reach immunity. That's what the government's trying to do. I saw in the Telegraph today, one commentator said, just pay young people to be vaccinated. I think there's actually a better case for that than there is for COVID status certification. But I do think it is wrong to create a divisive 2-tier society through COVID status certification. We need our nightclubs and everywhere else open for all.
And of course, the Prime Minister has been very against this sort of certification society. He's been very against ID cards in the past. There's speculation off the back of what the Prime Minister told the 1922 committee of backbench Conservative MPs last night, that this might not come in at all. And in some ways, this might be a sort of marketing ploy to try and get as many young people jabbed as possible. And then at the last possible moment, the Prime Minister can make some sort of extraordinary announcement saying, you know what, so many people are jabbed, we don't need this after all, well done everyone, hooray. Do you think that that's actually quite a likely path to follow?
I do think it's quite likely, but of course, if that is the case, then the plan's fallen apart already, because here we are discussing it on the news media the following day. You know, so I was at the 1922 committee, and it's clear to me that what the government is doing is trying to make it in young people's interests to get vaccinated. I think there are many ways we can make it in their interests. As I say, one of them could be to pay people when they're vaccinated. But, you know, this is not the way to go about it, particularly with nightclubs. People will go to nightclubs knowing what to expect. Either they'll be vaccinated and they know their level of risk, or they've chosen to go and accept a much higher level of risk without vaccination. I think that should be a matter of personal choice at this stage of the pandemic, because we know the vaccines are working to protect the vulnerable. So, you know, if ministers continue to be very worried about the effect of young people going to nightclubs on hospital capacity, they really should set out why, because we do know that for younger people without comorbidities, that's other diseases, that this is a mild to moderate disease for the vast majority of those young people. So the government should again be clear what they're trying to achieve. But, you know, I agree with what Boris Johnson used to say about ID cards, and indeed what Michael Gove previously has said about ID cards. I'm flat out against people having to show their papers for the pub, and I'm very disappointed that government has announced this policy.
Are you also disappointed that businesses don't seem to have taken up the government's advice in these areas, whether it's travel companies not necessarily mandating masks or some shops not doing that, and basically no nightclubs taking up the option of certification on the door? When the government brought in all of these suggestions, they were sort of assuming that there'd be personal responsibility not only from individuals but also businesses, some businesses choosing to use these government schemes to try and keep down the spread of the disease. As a big fan of personal responsibility yourself, Steve Baker, are you not disappointed that some businesses, or that most businesses, seem to have not implemented any of these schemes unless they're directly commanded to by the government?
Well, that's a very interesting point. I can certainly see that there'll be many business owners who will agree with me that they are going to be flat out against COVID status certification as a matter of principle, but also for pragmatic reasons. that it will cause them extra costs on the door, perhaps having extra staff. It means disappointing customers who want to come in and can't. There's technical problems, the capacity for fraud, all those sorts of things. So there's both practical and principled grounds for being opposed. And I think on this particular issue, I don't think it's absolutely strictly about personal responsibility. It's about cost and it's about principle. So I'm not disappointed in firms not taking it up. No, of course I'm not. And actually, I think many of the people in whose company I travel would agitate for a boycott of firms who adopted COVID status certification. When we started out on this journey, I had a debate with Nadeem Zahawi about just this issue, and he positively discouraged businesses in that debate from taking up COVID status certification. He encouraged them not to do it. So we've come a very long way from that debate to where we are today, that the debate has turned around completely. I think this is something that's got to be stopped. What's at stake here is the kind of society that we become for the long term. Where is our spirit of freedom? Where is our capacity to live with reasonable risk? And that's where we are now. We know the vaccines work. It's been a fantastic rollout. The vulnerable are protected. That means we're now down to reasonable levels of risk, the kind of levels of risk which are comparable to what we have normally lived with flu. And we wouldn't be having this conversation if we were facing a normal or even quite a bad flu winter. We certainly wouldn't be talking about lockdowns and restrictions if the first wave had only been as bad as this wave is right now. So, I think it's time for us to take stock and ask ourselves, what does a good and virtuous society look like with free and responsible people? And I think the government's duty is to set the facts before the public and do it in quite a straightforward way, and let people choose now what they decide to do, bearing in mind that the vaccines will protect the vulnerable from hospitalisation and death.
Well, Steve, I think you've spoken a lot of sense there, and we will watch with interest if that vote ever does come after recess over vaccine passports. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.